newer Star Trek shows aren't always well liked by longtime fans of the franchise in its earlier iterations. One of the most common criticisms is such series' tendency to go back to old characters as opposed to expanding the greater Star Trek universe. When it comes to some newer Star Trek media, I can understand and do agree to some extent. One newer Star Trek series that I think gets things right, though, is Strange New Worlds. I'll explain why in this video. Star Trek Strange New Worlds focuses on the voyages of the USS Enterprise under the command of Captain Christopher Pike, with Una Chin Riley as First Officer, aka Number 1, and Spock as Science Officer. This group of characters was originally established in the first pilot for Star Trek the original series, The Cage. That pilot was not favored, however, and instead the second pitched pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, ended up getting picked up for the full series. The show's creator Gene Roddenberry obviously liked the story and setup from The Cage, however, because he worked it into Star Trek canon through the two-part TOS episode The Menagerie. It's almost certain that the more expanded stories of Captain Pike, Number 1, and Spock are ones that Roddenberry always wanted to tell. Another point that The Menagerie sets up is that Spock served on the Enterprise under Pike for 11 years, quite some time, which undoubtedly left viewers curious about the events of those years. The second season of Star Trek Discovery, which featured Pike, Spock, and Una, only increased interest in that premise. Of course, Strange New Worlds comes along to tell those stories. The series also addresses other things that there would be questions about, such as how James Kirk and Spock met each other, or Spock and T'Pring's relationship prior to the events of the episode Amok Time. Star Trek the original series notably has little exposition. We never really get to see how its various characters got to be where they are other than occasional mentions of it in dialogue. This was intentional and even somewhat necessary at the time, and there was nothing wrong with doing things that way, but it still left some narrative points feeling less developed or expanded upon than they could be. It's very clear that the writers of Strange New Worlds have done their homework when it comes to the lore and timeline of the original series. They know exactly when certain key events take place and they account for it, such as Pike's future life-altering injury, Nurse Chapel meeting her fiancé-to-be Roger Corby, and Carol Marcus's pregnancy with her and Jim Kirk's child. There are a few mentions of the events of Star Trek Discovery, which is understandable given that series' place in the timeline and the fact that it led to the creation of Strange New Worlds, but knowledge of what happens in Discovery isn't explicitly required to understand this series, so it doesn't gatekeep. Even viewers who hadn't seen the original series or any Star Trek media would most likely have little to no trouble following along with the narrative of Strange New Worlds. Strange New Worlds also establishes context for some events of the original series, and does a good job of it in my opinion. In The Menagerie, Spock takes a huge risk for Pike's sake, and we learn from Strange New Worlds that Pike was very much like a father figure to him, which makes Spock's motivations in The Menagerie that much more compelling. Establishing that Spock and Nurse Chapel were once briefly in a romantic relationship gives context to how they act towards each other in the original series, with Chapel retaining her feelings from that time, but Spock not doing the same. Speaking of Chapel, in Strange New Worlds, she's given the attention and fleshing out that I think she always deserved, and there's so much more to her character than just her feelings for Spock. Dr. M'Benga also receives plenty of development in screen time, and Nyota Uhura's character is well established and expanded upon. The characters of Sam Kirk and T'Pring are also given more individual characterization that goes beyond their relationships to Kirk and Spock respectively. By playing out an alternate timeline scenario where Pike is in command of the Enterprise instead of Kirk during the events of the TOS episode Balance of Terror, the difference in how the two handle command and conflict is established, which gives characterization to both of them. Spock in particular is a bit more like how he was in The Cage than how he is in most of the original series, which makes sense given the timeline and the fact that at that point he was younger and still coming into himself. I also want to say that I believe Ethan Peck portrays the character of Spock quite expertly, and it seems as though he really looked into how Leonard Nimoy did the same, which shows in Peck's body language, expressions, and line delivery while in character. For those who have watched Star Trek Discovery, it's also tangible that Spock is still affected by the experiences he had from those events. The fact that he pursues relationships such as those with T'Pring and Chapel, which has received some fan criticism, could be read as an attempt by him to follow his now-lost sister's last piece of advice to him, to let people into his life when the opportunity emerges. Perhaps that was even the writer's intention, aside from the general television writing practice of exploring relationships between characters, including romantic ones. One thing I appreciate is how Pike and Una in particular only ever have a platonic relationship with one another, whereas many TV series have tried to put their lead male and female character into a romantic relationship that doesn't seem very plausible. Strange New Worlds also features a mixture of new and old characters. The legacy characters correspond to how they've been portrayed before, and the new ones are just as interesting and significant. As I said before, many previously established characters had much room for their stories to be expanded on, and Strange New Worlds recognizes that opportunity and makes good use of it. Like most Star Trek series, some episodes of Strange New Worlds have more serious plots, and some have more nonsensical plots, with some examples of the former being Memento Mori, All Those Who Wander, and Under the Cloak of War, and examples of the latter being The Elysian Kingdom, Those Old Scientists, and Subspace Rhapsody. In my opinion, some of the very best media out there has the ability to maintain the balance of serious and lighthearted, and this series upholds the Star Trek franchise's legacy of doing so since the original series. Most individual stories in this series span the length of only one episode, with somewhat less of a focus on overarching season and series-wide storylines than other Star Trek series such as Deep Space Nine and Discovery. Strange New Worlds could potentially benefit from having more time to develop its overall continuity if it had longer seasons with more episodes. That's all up to the network though, and the show still uses the runtime it is granted wisely. Some people have argued that the series title Strange New Worlds isn't entirely accurate to its actual events because not every episode is about exploring new planets. I legitimately believe that if the series title Star Trek Enterprise wasn't already taken, it would have instead been given to this series, as it really is more about the ship than anything else. Really, the two series could have had each other's names, since the series that's actually called Star Trek Enterprise does center heavily on planetary exploration. Of course, Strange New Worlds isn't perfect, but my criticisms against it are mostly pretty minor. My only major criticism is how the series portrays the Gorn species in a significantly different way than any other appearance of them, which I and many others don't think fits very well. The Gorn were never intended to be monsters, but rather another intelligent species that just happens to differ from humans in some ways. Every individual Star Trek series is not going to be liked by every single Star Trek fan, and that includes Strange New Worlds. People don't have to like it, I just hope they give it a chance by watching it for themselves instead of solely basing their judgment on what they've heard from others. Even if you don't like the first episode, the second is one of the very best in my opinion. I'd hate to think of there being an internal divide between people who like Strange New Worlds and those who don't. If people want to see Strange New Worlds as a separate continuity from the original series, doing so is entirely valid. I think just about all of us can agree on one thing though. Strange New Worlds is worth having been made if only because it gave us this iconic moment. So what do you think? If you've seen Star Trek Strange New Worlds, what's your opinion on it? If you haven't watched it, did my review convince you to give it a try? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. I've got some other content on Star Trek and there will be more to come, so be sure to check out my channel and subscribe. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.